So I'm going to introduce, so you've got the B team, basically, is going to introduce Colonel Ed DeVos. Ed graduated from Florida Southern College in 1969, and he served more than 20 years as an infantry officer. I read his book, by the way, that you can see up here, and it is an excellent book. I found out that he spent time along Highway 13 in South Vietnam between Lai Khe and Quan Loy, and I spent a lot of time on Highway 13 myself, so it was reading his book and hearing him describe where he was really interesting for me. He was an advisor to the 21st Infantry Division of the South Vietnamese Army, and while as an advisor, he earned 2 Silver Stars, which is pretty impressive to me. He also has the Legion of Merit, the Combat Infantryman's Badge, the Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry as an individual award, the Legion of Merit, and U.S. and German parachutist wings, and he's a Ranger. So we have to speak very slowly and carefully to him because you know how that goes. Words of one syllable work out best. In 2006, Ed and his wife Susan moved to McCormick, South Carolina, where he now spends the majority of his time writing in various publications. He has written 5 books. The Stain, which is a book about the centurion at the cross. The Chaplain's Cross, a story about a World War II air battle in the Pacific. Revenge at King's Mountain, about one of our most significant Revolutionary War battles. Family of Warriors, a story of 5 brothers who serve in 5 different locations in World War II, and his latest book, The Last 100 Yards, where Ed writes about his 20 years experience with infantry soldiers or about the strong men who demonstrate integrity and honor, courage, and valor. And each of these books is available in the normal Amazon and that kind of thing, as well as in bookstores, as well as there's some on the back table back there. So without further ado, Ed, you're on, pal.
Thanks, sir. Does this work okay? No? Yes? Got it? All right. Thank you. I couldn't help but be struck by the words here a few moments ago about the Vietnamese. I spent 1 year as an advisor to Vietnamese infantry. How many of you have been advisors, were advisors in Vietnam? If you stand up, please. Round of applause for these guys. Thank you. A lot of times we think in terms of what happened to the United States, to our soldiers. We think in terms of the wall. We think in terms of how many of us were wounded and that sort of thing. Think about the South Vietnamese. 1 million civilians were killed during the war. 250,000 Vietnamese soldiers were killed. 250,000. I was in a battle that very close to where we're talking about, was Highway 13. Lasted about 3 months. We were 21st ARVN Division, was initially in the Delta. We were deployed up to Lai Khe, and then we attacked north. This was in 1972, and most of you had already gone home. This was what's called the Easter Offensive. It was the North Vietnamese attempt to take over the country. They were trying to attack at An Loc and then drive straight south to take over the country. 21st ARVN was deployed north to Lai Khe, and then we were to attack north. 3-month battle. 21st ARVN Division was about 7,000 soldiers. At the end of those 3 months, there were more than 1,000 killed, 4,000 wounded. Of the company commanders, there were 27 company commanders. 21 of the 27 were wounded or killed. Of the 9 battalion commanders, 6 of the 9 were wounded or killed. Our advisory team of 25 guys, 4 killed, 18 wounded. So we think in terms of the Vietnamese soldiers, that's who these people are. And so I just want to thank you. So. Tough men, tough men. The last 100 yards. When we think of the last 100 yards, what does that mean to most people? Think of a football field. I want you to think in terms of your own, this is the goal post here. 100 yards later is that goal post over there. That goal post is defended by, let's just say, 10 people. It's going to take 30 of us at this goal line to attack and defeat those, that last 100 yards. It's called in Army parlance the most dangerous 100 yards in the world. Because imagine all those guys have got their weapons, all these guys have got their weapons, and we're trying to attack them and take that spot, the last 100 yards. That's what infantrymen do. That's our job. And we train very, very hard for that. We spend all of our time in terms of thinking in terms of transportation, whether it's in airborne forces or air mobile forces or mechanized courses. We think in terms of being trained to go in cold weather, desert weather, jungle, night, day, but the mission is still the same. Take that objective, that last 100 yards. I would be spoken to a number of different places, everywhere from Florida to North Carolina, from Georgia to South Carolina, and a lot of places in between, about our books. And we're invariably asked by people about, because of a book about soldiers, why Dad never talked about the war. Nobody ever talked about what he did. And I kept hearing that over and over and over again. And I began to think in terms of, would my children say the same thing? Yes, we moved from place to place to place, but did they know what Dad actually did? And so I began to write some of those things out as far as what we were doing, what we were trying to accomplish, what the Army was doing. And it was just going to be for my children. You've heard Bob Babcock's name here before. Well, Bob is my publisher. And Bob kept pushing me. He said, there's more to this than just your family. And so we began to expand that book more and more. Eventually, we hit on 4 different rules I kind of set up for myself. Number one, when you have a biography, most of them start off with I, me, and that sort of thing. And I said, I don't want to do that because that's boring, essentially. When you read a lot of autobiographies, you'll also notice that the person who's writing never makes any mistakes. That's not me. That's not me. So I put those mistakes in there. Third thing I noticed as I began to look at biographies is that some people would take some cheap shots at somebody else. That maybe this general writes a book, but then he says, Major so-and-so in the Pentagon wronged me. And I can't, why would you do that? Major so-and-so can't defend himself. And yet I would see that in different books. So I said, if someone has done me wrong, I'm not going to say what their name is. I may say a captain, or we have renamed this guy Joe or something, but we're not going to take some cheap shots. Fourth thing was lessons learned. Most autobiographies don't have lessons learned. And again, remember, I'm writing this for my children. And so I wanted to make sure that I had lessons learned at the end of each chapter. What this has really turned into then is in the last 2.5 years now, that book is now in 30 ROTCs in the country. Last year there were 6,000 Second Lieutenants commissioned through ROTC, 6,000. Almost 800 at this point in time have our book and are using it. We actually have a gentleman in here from North Georgia who purchased all the books for North Georgia. So all these different universities are using that book, and so it's something to consider. And if you'd like to talk to me about that later on as far as how your university, your school that you went to, if they had the book or not, I'll be glad to do that for you and take a look at that. What I thought I would do today, though, is when you begin to look in terms of this group, I asked a number of people, how many people in AVVBA, after you served in Vietnam, stayed in the service? Near as I can tell from the general numbers around, maybe 20% made the Army a career, or the Navy, or the Marines, Air Force, so forth. But most in here served your time in Vietnam and then went on to different things, businessmen. What I really wanted to do tonight, I talked to Bob about this a couple days ago in terms of what would be appropriate for this group. And I began to think in terms of perhaps what we need to talk about is just simply what did the Army do with all the things you saw in Vietnam? All of us were touched by Vietnam. We saw things that were good. We saw the best of men. We saw the worst of men. We saw some things we don't even want to think about, but we do. We think about our wives who were home waiting for that phone call. Think about the wives who meet us on R&R and then 7 days later have to go back again to someplace in that direction and we're going the other way. So all of us faced a lot of different things as we think about Vietnam, and think for a moment about the men who died with you. You can see their faces. You know their stories. You know their jokes. You know their laughter. And while they're not here, as long as you and I have breath, they will live. They will live. I say that because this may be a time for you to consider. I know Bob has worked with a number of you to try writing articles about what happened to you in Vietnam. You may want to consider doing that, again, expanding that, because each of you have your stories. And when you're gone, those stories are gone. They're just gone. Your children may be asking you the same questions my children asked me. What did you do during the war? What did you do? A lot of times we want to hide those things. We don't want to talk about them, but it's necessary to do that. But what I really considered also is for those of you who got out of the service, was the sacrifice worth it? With all those things that you saw, that you did, that you were part of, what happened when you left the service? And I'm here to tell you that the Army took those lessons learned from us, from each of us, and improved the service after you left. 1993, let's think about this for a minute. 1993, what happened? Major event. No more draft. So since then, every person in the service has volunteered to do that. So no more draft. Number two, in 1993, Congress, like it always does when a war is finished, they reduced the size of the activity strength, which was done. What would happen in the Army is we went through 4 reduction in forces for the officer corps. Think about that for a moment. 4 what were called rifts. Those rifts meant that if an officer served well, but for some reason something was wrong, he was caught at a board who basically said, we're going to keep these 2 guys, but this guy we're going to send home. Some of you were caught in that. That person or persons who were selected to leave the service had a choice. 1, leave the service totally, or 2, become an NCO. So that happened to us. Also part of that was the RIF was through regular Army officers also. These were West Pointers. And so the Army is reducing the officer strength. Second thing that happened is we began to really look hard at how we can take this force and what's our next object? What are we going to fight next after Vietnam? Where are we going to go? And we began to think in terms of Europe all over again. In the infantry school, it was quite. This is even 3 months after I'd left Vietnam in December of 1972. At the advanced course, the tactics officer, every day, tactics instructor, walk in and say, wonder what Clyde's doing today. Clyde? Who's Clyde? Clyde is the Russian officer who's going to meet you in the Fulda Gap. He's going to outnumber you by 4 to 1. How is he working harder than you're working today? That became our modus operandi, is we got to work harder than the Russian does. And so that was instilled in the officer corps right away after Vietnam, is we've got a new enemy and we better get ready for it because it's going to happen. Think of the tanks that you had in Vietnam, okay? A lot of that tanks that you see on TV, it's called the M1, those were all invented, if you will, in the mid-70s. We began to look forward and see that. Same with the Bradley fighting vehicle. Aviators, how many aviators are in here? Look at all those hands, okay. Thank you. All the rest of us flew on your Hueys, thank you very much. But imagine now in 1975, there's what's called a fly-off. The Army was going to have a new and improved utility helicopter. There were 3 companies that were vying for this contract, and the fly-off was at Fort Benning, Georgia. So, interestingly enough, on this one day, all 3 of these helicopters would do their spins and twirls and so forth. But one of them, imagine going down an airstrip at Lawson Army Airfield, and then doing a complete 360 loop. That's the Black Hawk helicopter. That's the kind of equipment that we were working on in the 1970s. So when you all left, you didn't see that. But those of us who stayed in, we would see that sort of thing. How many of you have seen Top Gun? Everybody's seen Top Gun. What does the Army do for that? What's the Army equivalent? It's called the National Training Center. That was started in around 1976, 77. If you're on the road between Los Angeles and Las Vegas on that interstate, you come to Barstow, California. Barstow, California is about halfway between the two. Then you take the road 35 miles north, and you come on this little hill, and all of a sudden you look at the mountain range out there to the north of you. That's the southern end of Death Valley. And you've got a spot of around 30 miles by 30 miles that is called Fort Irwin. That's the National Training Center that the U.S. Army uses. There would be a unit there that was stationed there full-time called the OP-4. What they did is they trained on Russian tactics. They've been doing this since the middle 70s. Our unit, let's say we're stationed at Fort Stewart, Georgia. We're going to go and we're going to train against the OP-4 because we want to train against the Russians. So just when you think of Top Gun, it's the same kind of thing. We want to train our guys to fight against the Russian tactics and do it live fire as best we can to really see what they do, how they do it. So we had the National Training Center. It's been around for a number of years, and we still use it today. Think in terms of when you begin to, for the wives, for the families. When you went to Vietnam, what kind of structure did we have to take care of the families? There wasn't much, if anything. Maybe an individual unit commander may say, let's take a look at this, or let's try and keep in touch. But we formalized that quite a bit where the family members have basically got a contact with other family members. Typically the battalion commander's wife, and I'll use Susan as an example. She's in charge of the families while I'm gone. And she's able to contact all those families to keep them in the loop and see what's going on, to help those that need help. We really took at that, look at that. We began to think in terms of doctrine. Did we have the right doctrine? What we had for Vietnam was perhaps the right thing, but all of a sudden now, will that be the same as we need on the Fulda Gap? Or the same we need in the desert? We began to think in terms of new field manuals. Early in probably around 75 or so, there was basically an argument that came to a draw. You had the infantry school, the armor school writing this manual together. Trained in Doctor Command, which is over both those organizations, just couldn't resolve the thing. And so one day the 4-star general of TRADOC met with the 2-star general of Fort Benning and the 2-star general of Fort Knox. They went into a room smaller than this, rolled up their sleeves and hammered out the field manual. Because the two schools couldn't come together, but the 4-star said, we're going to get this thing done, and we're going to get it done now. And so you had that kind of impetus to get those things done, to get the soldiers the best trained possible, to get them the best manuals, to get them the best equipment. That's happened over and over and over again. Around 1982, General Wickham was the Army Chief of Staff. He was concerned about the ability of the Army to project power into all parts of the world, not just into Europe, not just into the Middle East, but maybe into South America, here, there, everywhere. Needed a light mobile force to do that. From that idea, from what was called the white paper, we have the light infantry divisions was formed. This was the chance to really take an infantry battalion. Think of your infantry battalions in Vietnam, about 700 people, if the TO needs correctly. Reduce this to about 500 so that you can just deploy it more rapidly. And oh, by the way, you will specialize in night warfare. You own the night. And everything we did was to own the night. General Wickham this was his baby. I was fortunate enough at Fort Ord, California to be the XO of the Army's 1st Light Infantry Battalion. The very first one. This was the test. What's most interesting about that is that we had General Wickham's guidance on what he was looking for. Every 6 weeks, General Wickham, 4-star, Chief of Staff of the Army, would come to our battalion conference room. The battalion commander, myself, the company commanders were talking to the Army Chief of Staff about what we were doing, how we were doing it, and just to make sure that we were on board with what he was looking for. And from that developed the 10th Mountain Division, the 25th Infantry Division. So we had those things that were going on just to make sure that we could meet the needs of the service. All of you who were in Vietnam, started the ball rolling. You saw those things and you kind of went, we can be done better. And so the Army heard you. One of the things, if you think about your unit in Vietnam, how was it to, all of a sudden when you had a replacement, day after more replacements, every day there were new people, every day your squad didn't look like it did before. Part of the light infantry division was to make all those battalions cohort battalions. What that means is that we would start a battalion, and I was fortunate enough to be able to do this in 10th Mountain. I was the battalion commander with the sergeant major. We were the first 2 guys in the battalion, very first. I was given 6 files to pick my company commanders from. Sergeant major had about 8 to pick us first sergeants from. So we picked those. The Army then supplied all of our platoon leaders, all of our squad leaders, all of our platoon sergeants, and we trained for them from September of 1986 to March of 1987. Training the leaders, all of us, so we all knew what we were trying to do. What was the whole thing? We knew what we were doing. Simultaneously, the soldiers, the privates, were at basic training and advanced individual training at Fort Benning. So they were being trained over here. We were getting all of our TONEs and everything squared away here, all the things we wanted to do, all the tactics. When these guys finished from basic training AIT, then they came over to Fort Drum, and that was our battalion. We were going to be together for 3 years. Imagine how good a battalion can be if you don't have any changes. If you've got the same guys who are going to be there for 3 years and they know it. What's interesting about that is the soldiers begin to police themselves. I remember one day walking down a battalion street and saw a soldier, so-and-so. He was really scruffy. He'd obviously been in a fight. And I asked Sergeant Major, I said, Sergeant Major, what happened to Jones? He said, you don't want to know. Thank you, Sergeant Major. So we kept on walking. Later on, what I found out was this young private over here, within his squad, he wasn't pulling his weight. His squad members just basically beat him up and said, don't do that again, because we're going to be with you for 3 years. And that's what they did. And so the soldiers policed themselves to make sure we had the best that we could possibly have. So it was a different kind of thing, different kind of Army. Again, thanks to all of us really who were in Vietnam, because we did certain things that worked well. We did some things that didn't go so well. And so that was where that was. The book is also, we get into, the book is now being used, I mentioned ROTCs. The reason why is many of you, when you got ROTC commissions, if you're like mine, it was at Florida Southern. We had a professor of military science. He was a lieutenant colonel. I don't think I ever saw him. He certainly didn't teach any classes. We just didn't see him. What has now happened in ROTCs across our country right now is you've got the lieutenant colonels who have got 4 and 5 and 6 combat tours. They are the guys who are trained the MS-4s before they're commissioned. They are the guys who look at them in the eye and say, yes, this person, I'm going to commission him, but this one, not so fast. And so they're being, these PMSs now are the cream of the crop in many cases in terms of taking hold of those ROTCs and really making sure that we are getting quality people at every second lieutenant level in the service. So those things have happened. Those things. One of the things, as I mentioned, the book that we've got, The Last 100 Yards, is being used by right now 30 ROTCs around the country. The list is growing. And if you would like to know if your ROTC that birthed you has that book, I'll let you know. I'm certainly glad to talk to you about that. And if you'd like to consider maybe taking a look at how you could help out with that, we can look at that too. But just know that the Army is progressing. We're trying to get better. We're trying to do things. I'm extremely pleased by talking to these lieutenant colonels because, and in some cases colonels, simply because the combat experience they have, they do not want to let it sit on the shelf. They want to. They've got the incentive, they've got the drive, they've got the desire to teach each and every one of those people that they're going to make a second lieutenant. And we should be very proud of that. Ladies and gentlemen, that's really what I want to mention to you. Again, I want to thank you for the opportunity to think of these brave soldiers. And it's interesting within the ROTC world that I've talked to different people at different times. In the last year, I've talked to two lieutenant colonels. One is artillery, one is air defense. Both of them are Vietnamese descent. Their parents, their fathers were majors and lieutenant colonels in the Vietnamese Army. These guys are now lieutenant colonels in your Army, and they're doing a great job. What can I answer? Questions, thoughts? Well, this is easy. Oh, yes, sir. No.
Any questions?
I was a sergeant 2 Fulters, battalion commander, followed by Cole Kinsey. I was there for 2 cycles. 2 cycles.
Okay. Yep.
It's a great experiment.
It's a great experiment, and make sure that really when we do that, imagine having the same boss, the same platoon sergeants, the same lieutenants all the time. It's really a wonderful concept, and one that works very, very well. The personnel system has a little difficulty with that simply because how they fence those people for a certain period of time, but it definitely works well for the unit itself. So thank you for that, Sergeant. Other thoughts? Yes, sir.
I grew up from the Vietnam vets, going to West Point, listening to the instructors. And so we got the benefit. Oh, yeah, I'll speak louder. Anyway, we got to hear the stories, but we also got to see the changes. General Starry started the mid-level officer training, how to be a staff officer, and how to speak in sentences, paragraphs, and nothing more than a page, which was great. I thought it was one of the best classes I had. At the National Training Center, I went to Desert Storm as the tank company commander, and then I went to four other places. National Training Center was harder than going to war, and that was great because it got us prepared. And every time I thought, wow, that was tough. When I went back the next time, it was even tougher, and they integrated more and more. Now to the point they have villages, they have people hired, and they're the locals. How you treat the locals is how they interact with the units in the field. So if you dismiss them, all of a sudden you start getting hit. Your supply lines get hit by these guys. Mortar rounds come into your area. They also even have newspaper folks that come up and interview the battalion commanders. Not too loud. But they'll interview the battalion commanders, and then they'll chop up their stuff and have a TV program. And so what they thought was a good interview turns into their speaking against the U.S. government. So it trains everybody from the top down, and the after-action reviews every day are brutal. They go down and cut people down. And it all goes back to the experience from the officers and NCOs from Vietnam that were putting that in to build the military.
Exactly. Thank you. I think also several things I failed to mention there too. The training is different on the formal side. We now have a Sergeant Major's Academy that started a number of years ago. So you've got Sergeant Majors who are trained to in ways that the Army wants them to consider, and it's just been a much better thing. We also got what's called the SAMS course. Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, used to be, when you go to CGSC, Command General Staff College, 1 year and you left. They started the SAMS course, which was for selected officers to stay for an extra 1 year or maybe 2 years to really go into advanced tactics and to really look at things a little bit harder, a little bit better in terms of how to tactically employ units. General Schwarzkopf got a lot of good press in terms of how he fought the war in the year 2000. All of his G3 guys were SAMS guys. All those people were, we call Jedi warriors, is what we actually called them. So the training has just gotten better and better and better. So, yes, sir.
I have a request from my son, who is just completed 1 year of command in the 2nd Brigade, 25th Infantry Division in Hawaii. My son, Colonel Graham White's been in 23 years, and here's his request to all of my brothers and the Vietnamese soldiers. Here's his thank you. Again, he's been in the Army 23 years, 11 combat deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan, leading Army Rangers, wounded in 03, given 12 hours to live. A lot of prayers, he did live. Commanded twice in Ranger Battalion, an Airborne Battalion, a Ranger Battalion, and now a brigade in the 25th. He said, Dad, next time, I saw him about several weeks ago, and he had a little bit of a break. He said, Dad, please tell all, and I can't think of a larger group that we've had here than today, so I think it's appropriate. And I thank you for bringing out the points that the lessons learned from Vietnam that have gone on to make our Army as great as it was in Panama, Desert Storm, Desert Shield, Afghanistan, and Iraq. He said, Dad, please thank all you Vietnam veterans, because I know the way that you guys were treated back in the late 60s and early 70s. He said, from the day one that we, starting actually in Desert Storm, but then later in Afghanistan, Iraq, he said the great way that we are treated, Mary Lou, and you're the one part of this, is due to the Vietnam veterans saying, we will never let our servicemen and women be treated like we were at the end of the 60s and the early 70s. He said, God bless you, thank you, because you've made us proud, and there's systems out there, there's thank yous out there that would not exist without the efforts and the heart and the Vietnam veteran sense. That is never going to happen in our nation. So from Colonel Graham White, he says thank you to this generation of veterans. Thank you.
Well said, man.
It's it.
Always welcome home.
Interesting that brought up. Several weeks ago, I had the opportunity to have dinner, essentially, with one of the command sergeant majors of Delta Force. His words are exactly the same as what you just heard. Exactly the same. So people know, people appreciate it. One of the things I always try and mention to people too is and I'll close with two more things. Whenever we see service members, this group is not normal. We're not normal because when we see a service member in uniform, we're going to go up to him and say, hey, Sergeant, what do you do? What's your MOS? Which favorite place? We'll talk to him. However, I'll say the civilian world out there doesn't do that. Civilian world, if we're lucky, they'll say, thank you for your service and keep on walking. So continue to do what you're doing. Have a dialogue. Be able to say thank you for what you're doing. Also, I'd ask you to do one more thing. In my book, as I begin to close with the book, I began to think in terms of mentors. At one point in time, I had a camp with like 35 people that were mentors to me when I was in the service. Some for short periods of time, some for longer. And as I began to think about all the impact they had on me, I thought I've got to put something in the book about mentors. I boiled that list down to 5 people. Then I realized that 3 of them were already dead. You have mentors. You have mentors that led you, guided you, taught you, loved you when you didn't be loved, shouldn't be loved. They gave you tips. And you are who you are because of who they were. So take a chance, take some time, if you would please, and give them a call. Thank them. Because they live in you and you live in them, essentially. But as I say, when I had this same talk to a group in, we live in McCormick, South Carolina, so a group over in that area. A friend of mine who read the book took me up on that. He called several of his mentors. This is a civilian guy. The 2 people he called, when he called them, they cried. Nobody had ever thanked him before. Nobody ever had taken the time to say thank you for what you did. So consider that if you would, please. Sir, thank you for your time.
Thank you, sir.